Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Um, After recording last week's episode, Matt and I were debriefing, and we got into a bit of a um, shouting match about the use of language, especially when it's related to kind of politics and political terminology. So we thought this would be a good conversation to have. Um, I linked him to Orwell's essay, Politics and the English Language. I don't know how much we'll touch on the essay itself. I think the conversation is much broader than what Orwell's talking about. Matt was just saying at some level, this essay is more about how to be a good writer. And speaking is not the same thing as writing, of course. But of course, I'm someone who thinks a lot about I guess my use of language, um, because I do try to be as clear and precise in my use of language as possible. Um, Obviously, there's different in different contexts you can use different terminology, um, but I don't think we should use that necessarily to justify sloppy use of language, because language um, is really the best way humans have kind of created, or the best way that communication has. Um, well, okay, I don't want to get into like weird linguistic debates, but like language is a very effective way of communicating abstract ideas. Um, so I do think it's very important to in how the individual uses language, because of course, if you're using sloppy language, then your meaning can get muddled. Um, I think you and I are probably going to disagree on, I guess, things like truth and right or wrong, or incorrect or incorrect. Um, but if we can avoid that, we should try to avoid that as much as possible, because I really am attacking the use of sloppy language. Um, and it's not that important to me to say it's correct or incorrect so much as it's important for me to say it's sloppy. Of course, the thing that I was commenting on in our original conversation was in the beginning of Dave Rubin's terrible, atrocious book. The opening paragraph is about Hitler as a left winger, and I was saying, well, that's an incorrect use of the term left winger. But I mean, I guess I could say it's just a sloppy use of the term left winger. We can use whichever term, sloppy or incorrect, you want to use. But I do think it's a use of language which is unhelpful and which is concealing more than it's revealing. And I noticed that everyone notices this with politicians. It's like uh, long ago, Bill Clinton, when the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal came up, he well, don't even have to use that a particular example, but I was thinking, he was like putting it in such a way as to kind of distance himself from the guilt. He wasn't necessarily saying statements that are technically incorrect, but he was saying things in such a way as to minimize people's anger towards him. So, but other politicians do this all the time. I mean, so do journalists and other media figures. So do political commentators. Um, and also just people in everyday life, use language to give people certain impressions that may not really be the complete picture. Um, so I don't know. Language is a weird thing, and there's so many different angles we can look at it. But I think I'll let you jump in here.
Yeah, I wanted to throw some thoughts out there, and I wanted to kind of get a feel for where we are getting past each other. So a lot of my thoughts on the use of language, especially when we're talking about things like politics, is somewhat context dependent. And I think the reason why you have an instinctive, like almost, you are almost repulsed by the use of language in certain settings. But I think the reason why I'm more quick to defend use of sloppy language is because the people you're criticizing are often political commentators, and expecting clear language out of political commentators, I think is just so, I don't think it's unreasonable, because ideally, people would think very clearly in a very concise way that perfectly portrays the idea they're trying to portray in a very simple way. But I think that class of pundits is kind of like either inherently bad intentioned, and a lot of bad intentioned people, like politicians who give stump speeches, use like very loaded rhetoric in a way of forcing emotions into points without giving really any concrete information. So the pundit classes consists of people like that who generally have an agenda that they're pushing, and they're using language as a tool to push the agenda and not necessarily to inform. And then you have people who are generally not very intelligent. So a lot of the times, if we're critiquing these people for their use of language, it's either me critiquing propaganda, or we're talking about people who I think are just not very bright. And since the intention doesn't seem obviously bad there, I'm less eager to jump on them and more eager to just call them a poor thinker who's communicating poor ideas in a very colloquial setting. So the people that they're talking to kind of know their jargon, and they might use language that is in ways that aren't defined historically accurate. But I don't even really think that matters that much, because people who are observing the content in the normal context understand that they're kind of exaggerating, they're potentially being bombastic, it's not meant as literally or historically true. But then I know that, like, if I wanted to get news about, say, the gross domestic product numbers in the United States, and I wanted to see how GDP changed in Q2 of 2021, I would expect the reporting to be very concise and very, very, very blunt, and tell me like all they know. So I'd expect it to be like very industry specific language that is clear and is accurate. Like, there are times where I'd expect that, but I wouldn't expect that out of a lot of pundits who are either have bad agendas. So I guess to reference the Orwell piece, I would agree with him that a lot of the like the best way to portray your thoughts are in concise, precise language, and to preferably not use bad writing elements like bad metaphors and stuff like that. But in the end, I think a lot of people who observe American politics will eagerly agree and say most of the people who are on the front lines aren't particularly intelligent or good at communicating things in an intellectually honest way. And a lot of the good communicators that are seen as charismatic are because they do the things that Orwell resents, like using bombastic language to dress up bad ideas. So that's kind of my opening thoughts on the broad picture. I think we might want to zoom in on, I guess, an element of that, because I laid out a few things there. But I will recognize that I don't think you're wrong to think that people should use precise language. I'm just kind of throwing out there that it's not unique that bad language is used poorly. I don't think it means what the person's communicating is inherently wrong. I just think it's sloppy and kind of low intelligence. But a lot of the people in that area are either intentionally sloppy or they're low intelligence. So I think it's kind of inevitable. And I guess you are directionally correct. Like, it would be better if Dave Rubin didn't say Hitler's a left winger. He could say, one could argue that Hitler's a left winger because here are traits I associate with the left wing, or with the ideas of the left wing, and here's how Hitler lines up with that. And then you could see that, oh, he doesn't inherently say everybody on the left wing is genocidal, but that is an easy assumption for somebody's brain to make, so that's why it could seem dishonest. So it's kind of like, yeah, or maybe Dave Rubin's just not very smart and isn't a very good writer. Or he's a dishonest pundit, if we want to read bad intentions into him. So it's kind of a give and take that I think we kind of see eye to eye on, but maybe our intuitions of how important it is or how much of a injustice it is might really differ.
I mean, like I said in the beginning, I mean, there's like kind of a couple traps kind of hidden in this conversation. I mean, one, this could, because then we could get into questions of like, then how are we defining certain things, and how do you come to know if something is true or false? So if I used again that example, calling Hitler a left winger, again, I'm confident in saying that the history is on my side, but then we can use but in politics, people I mean, part of it I actually think is just related to just the weirdness of American culture. But putting that aside, it's just people find ways to define words. They use a bunch of weird, they jump through a bunch of hoops and make a bunch of weird arguments and evasions and just generally squirrely behavior, and to find ways to define a word in the exact way that they want to define it. Um, but at that point, then it's like, well, any word can mean literally anything. um this is especially true of political terms. It's like when David Horowitz calls Obama a communist, he's asserting Obama is a radical left winger. And again, I think the history is on my side when I say Obama's not a radical left winger, even if you despise Barack Obama. But again, it's like we get into the influence of postmodernists, or of postmodernism, which just takes a very loose view of language. But I just don't think that loose view of language is helpful when we're trying to have difficult conversations. To some degree, we have to try to accept. Um, we have to accept certain things in order to properly communicate. Um,
Okay, so I think I'm seeing where I push back a lot on you then. Um, so I guess I would say I'm more postmodernist, but I don't think it's ungrounded when it comes to language, because I think the context helps clarify what the person's saying. So you can have an argument of, is David Horowitz wrong for calling Obama a communist, and then saying, well, the standard historical use of communism is this, and Obama is not trying to nationalize the means of production. But then David Horowitz would probably argue like, well, he's the person who did this reform in the healthcare side of the United States, and that is a step that he thinks could naturally bleed towards nationalizing healthcare, which would be potentially nationalizing an industry. And then he'd be like, so you know what? I consider him this and this. And there are a bunch of people who would agree with that colloquial use and maybe interpret it in a way that is looser than the word indicates. So I guess what I'd say is like, yeah, is Obama not a communist in the historic sense of the word communist? It's like, well, of course not, or at least not in the way he's putting forward policy in the United States. He's not. But are a bunch of people understanding what David Horowitz means, and or is everybody listening to that interview thinking, oh my God, he actually thinks Obama wants to nationalize every industry? And it's like, well, nobody thinks that's what David Horowitz is arguing. So to some extent, it's like I will happily say, okay, he's being sloppy with his use of words, but he is a pundit, so he's trying to invoke a reaction, right? And he is directionally correct in the sense that he's saying Obama's really far left, and at least a lot of people in the United States that are Republicans at the time of the interview agreed with him. So it's how incorrect is his use of the word. Now, I think part of where I agree with you is a lot of the people who do use sloppy language are not trying to have a good faith discussion. So I would say this is about like pretty much every politician who talks during their stump speech. None of what they're saying is designed to invoke a good faith, productive. It's never with the intent of I want to actually talk about an issue and hash things out and convince you of my position. It is meant to use language that is charged and to convey whatever their agenda is. It's not a step forward towards reason, and that's a bad thing. But that's how they communicate. And so to some extent, I would say, okay, you're right. Unless we agree on certain terms and we are actually, and we agree on them, and then we move forward talking that way, we can't have a productive discussion. But a lot of people don't want to have a productive discussion. So maybe that's why this is a perpetual problem, especially when it comes to any political term, because political terms like populist can be so context dependent that they're like almost unusable.
So, I mean, it's hard to. Do you have a particular direction you want this conversation to go from here? So, because I mean, I guess what I would have to say quickly in response, and then maybe you can jump in here. I think So that I mean, that example, like David Horowitz calling Obama a communist. I mean, it's an extension. This is me taking the historical perspective as I've been taking, but that's a byproduct of the Red Scare. It's like, oh, so, communism's evil. Soviet Union bad, U.S. good. Everything that's bad is communist. Everything that's good is, neoliberal capitalism. Or, well, no, this was even before neoliberal capitalism as we understand it. Just U.S. good, Soviet communism bad. And so it's like everyone that became, everyone that was thought of as a political subversive or just a person who wasn't going to go along with the establishment became a communist. And that's why, of course, like in Hollywood, there was people blacklisted for being supposedly communist. Even many people who weren't communists, who might have just been somewhat left wing, oh, they're communists now. They're not allowed to get any jobs. So it's a use of language which as you say, is bombastic, which invokes certain uses certain buzzwords to get certain emotional reactions from people, which then causes people to behave in certain ways. And behave in certain ways, and to advocate for certain policies and whatnot, which are derived from the sloppy arguments. Again, I don't think there's any way of saying Obama is a far left winger, but I don't know if we probably don't really want to have that conversation at this time.
I do have a relevant point that I feel like has to be addressed, considering that you're kind of taking the kind of skeptic to postmodernist view of language. But I'm sitting here and I made that kind of throwaway comment about populism, like how it's borderline unusable. And one of the things is, a lot of these terms, I don't know if they're, I can't even imagine what the correct way to define it is. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you look at Orwell, he's saying be precise and be concise. I think that's how I would summarize a lot of what Orwell's saying, how people, if they want to communicate good ideas, that's what they should do. I think there are a ton of core terms in the U.S. political discourse that do not have precise meanings at all. And I don't know what to do about that in this context. So, like, the phrase right wing, or the phrase left wing for that matter, like what do those words even mean? Right? Because so much of it, and this is why I get postmodernist, the only way I'd be able to answer that is saying, well, it's the context of the political environment in which you say it. So right wing in 1980 means a lot. It could mean very different things from right wing in 2020. I don't think that they're principled terms, really, but then those things get confused with stuff like the political compass, which is supposed to be this test that shows a ton of people over time, and these people are more right wing, these people are more left wing, and you kind of get to what do right wing and left wing even mean? So are those terms that should be, I guess, abandoned because they're inherently imprecise, or is there a time where they're acceptable?
I mean, the one thing. So, of course, the issue when you're talking about language is just the fluidity of language. And I don't think even Orwell would disagree with that. I certainly would not disagree with that. But what I disagree with is using language in a certain way, which is trying to, which is, again, imprecise in the sense that you're not thinking about carefully. You're not saying what you're saying, as carefully as possible. You're trying to get people to do something, or to advocate for something, or to believe something. Excuse me. By just using the language that is going to get to people, needle people the most. So again, it's like communist in the U.S. is one of the worst things you could be. So David Horowitz says Obama's a communist because he thinks Obama's Hitler. Well, okay, I'm exaggerating, but he thinks Obama's like one of the worst people. So I'm using bombastic language, excuse me. He thinks Obama's one of the worst people, imaginable, basically. So he's using this language to muddy the waters. And I'm not here to say Obama is just this greatest person, in human history, or the greatest person alive today. But I think when you're using language in such a way to paint Obama as this horrible, far left, horrible, like, political being that's gonna take away all your freedoms, um, then you are being imprecise, because you're using language in such a way as to, not because you're really thinking about the historical context. You have an agenda, and again, you're using that language purely to fit the agenda. I mean, I think left or right. Um, left or right might be breaking down in the modern time, because we have to remember the left and right developed out of the French Revolution, when people, um, uh, a group of people, met to originally to form a constitutional monarchy. Obviously, it didn't work out that way. The people on the right were monarchists. The people on the left, were, I guess, either small R Republicans, or wanted a more more limited monarchy, constitutional monarchy, let's say. So that's where we get these terms. I think they're still useful. Um, I think imprecise terms can be useful. But you have to be, again, you have to be clear. This is an imprecise term. This is a more precise term. I always think people need to be clear about how they're using language and what they're trying to communicate using that language. That's the rule I always set for myself. If I'm using an imprecise term, I'll say that. If I'm using a more precise term, I'll say that. It doesn't, and at some level, it doesn't matter to me if I hold everyone to a high standard, especially if they're talking about something like politics, because I think, again, as I said in the last episode, I think it's important, whether we're bombing Iran, or I think it's important what our healthcare system is. So I'm going to be hard on the politicians. I'm going to be hard on the pundits and the journalists and people in the media when they're using improper language, because these are important matters we're trying to talk about. And if you're using sloppy language, then again, you're probably either trying to hide something, or you're just you haven't learned enough, or aren't applying yourself enough to talk more precisely.
So so one of the fun things about this show is we do it pretty much on the fly. We have an idea, and then we feel through a conversation, and this is raising so many I guess examples and thoughts in my head that I'm not even sure where to start. And it's not because you're wrong and I'm disagreeing with everything you say, because that's what normally happens when we argue about policy. But it's because I think that this is just a very ubiquitous across like so much of the political spectrum. And not even coming from individuals, but it's like the whole scene of politics where I guess I'll start with a relevant example, and then I'll steer us in another way that might go somewhere. So one term that I don't like, that you might be more sympathetic to, but I'm not sympathetic to, is the phrase systematic racism. And one of the reasons I push back on that term is because it will point to things that are inequitable, right? So it will point to something that has disproportionately affected different groups if you break something down by race. And then we'll say, because this is not equal effect, it's not affecting all races in an equally positive way. It is a system that is systematically a racist system. Or else it would help certain groups of people. It would help all people of color or white people, all people equally. So one of my issues is, depending on which race you want to defend, you can really make this case for all policies. I have to debunk my feelings on it before I can get to my true point. But if you look at any policy, it'd be insane if it affected every racial group exactly the same in terms of quantitative data, because we all know that racial demographics don't line up perfectly with income and wealth. So if any policy was race neutral in terms of its actual effects and practice, that would be insane. So you can make a case that any policy is you can argue it's systematically racist, any policy that you want to, as long as you pick whatever race it's disproportionately affecting. Now, I think that this charge is so prevalent, especially in like the last 2 or 3 years, is because nobody wants to get called a racist. pretty much the worst, one of the worst things you can get accused of being is a racist person, especially like I know we're in our 20s. So like if somebody genuinely in their heart of hearts like thinks you're racist, that's a pretty bad allegation. So now by pointing at something that is pretty much inherent, that a policy will not have the same quantitative effects on every population group, now something is being called systematically racist. Well, you could define it in that way, and then the term can be correct, but it's clearly being used to use a very virulent word in a context that is indicting of a system, even though I don't think it's possible for a system to not be systematically racist in the way they define it. The thing that I find so disheartening about the use of the term, though, is I listen to a lot of things from think tanks, and I listen to a lot of things from like the neoliberal elite, right? So I listen to like the Rand Corporation, I listen to, the Atlantic Council, and they like these terms a lot. And these are the people who, I mean, if politics is supposed to be about being concise and precise, you can write down the whole Libertarian Party platform on one piece of paper. You can write down their policy stance on a bunch of things on one piece of paper, and then you can allude to a book that could hypothetically have 300 pages of very clear, statistically driven analysis of why that policy is good. So there could be no bloviating, no punditry involved in that. It could just be like, here's a concise sentence of what the goal is. Here's 300 pages of like Cato Institute publications defending it, and there wouldn't be any of that bloviating stuff that we're critiquing. And then people can bring that evidence together and have a reasonable discussion. My issue is when I hear things from like the Atlantic Council, they're supposed to be the people that are like the Cato Institute. They're supposed to be think tanky people. And still there ends up being these terms that break into their, word choice that are so charged in a way that isn't intellectual or like rational. It is still like this harsh rhetoric that is designed to make people a certain way seeps into all of it. So I guess I'm not trying to imply by me saying all this that you're for it at all. This is just a thought that arose out of what you were saying. But I find this problem, I mean, I'm willing to agree with Orwell and say like things like these ways that emotional language seeps into something and obscures the point and obscures real information is bad. I just almost don't know what to do about it except for bring it up here and complain about it. But then the concern is, well, how should people be talking about it? And is everything propaganda? Because I feel like as I lay this out, I'm drawing this like thing where here's a phrase that is used prominently, and I think this is propaganda. So how do I escape, I guess, this issue, and how do I escape just being a fool who calls everything propaganda? Because I don't want to be a nut that thinks like everything's trying to like brainwash me. But I kind of think the phrase is loaded for that reason, to try to drive emotions in certain people. So I know I dumped a lot, but I think that's something to think about in the context of this conversation.
So, ironically, actually, and I think I mentioned this in another episode, I just don't remember which one. It's on the record somewhere. Orwell said, all art, not in this essay, but he said somewhere else, all art is propaganda. So he basically thought, because he was saying like all art is political, all art is trying to persuade you, all art is of something, and all art is trying to make an argument in Orwell's mind. So because people in his time and even today, they would say like take a popular a movie at the time or a novel or something, and they'd be like, oh, this is totally apolitical, has nothing to do with questions about values or meaning or truth or whatever. It's just a mindless pastime. And Orwell was one of the first people to do kind of like pop culture criticism, pop culture reviews, and he'd be like, no, this is actually trying to argue in favor of conservative values because this and this, and he'd break it down. But so that's one thing I just wanted to lay out there. It's true that the left does uses bombastic language and uses language imprecisely, just like the right does. And I think the identity politics is generally where this comes out the most, which is why I don't. I deeply resent anyone on the left who does like throw around homophobic, racist, sexist, all these terms. They throw them around casually. again, because I think they're not taking the language seriously. So if someone says to me, if someone were to say to me, "Oh, Matthew, you're a racist," well, I might get upset about that because I'm taking the word seriously, because I'm trying to go back to what the word should mean, which is prejudice in a certain racial, prejudice against a certain race or certain races. But now it just is a word that's used again to uh, smear somebody, to make somebody look bad, to invoke negative emotions or evoke certain emotions in the audience, which is why so much internet debate, it does go back to just exchanging charged words, because that's enough to persuade people who aren't taking the time to read the arguments. So maybe this is slightly off topic example, but it's like there was a whole controversy a while back when Sam Harris was on Bill Maher's show, and they were talking about Islam, and Ben Affleck was on the show as well. Sam Harris and Bill Maher, of course, were being very extremely critical of Islam, like they always are. And then Ben Affleck, turned around and was like, "No, you guys are actually Islamophobic. You don't, and he wasn't really listening to what Harris and Maher were saying. He was just, he didn't want to think in that moment. If I don't know if it's okay to criticize Ben Affleck these days, but he didn't want to think in the moment. He didn't actually want to engage in a high level intellectual discussion. He saw an easy way out, or he actually believes what he's saying, and he was like, "Okay, you're Islamophobic. Over, done with. We can move on." And so this problem is rampant, and I'm not just saying it's related to right wingers. As for systematic racism, I mean, I think that term could be justified again when you take the historical point, given the scar that slavery and segregation has left on the country. But I don't suppose you wanted to have that conversation here either. I hope that covered most everything you mentioned.
Yeah. We won't have that. We won't have that discussion on this one. But I think the reason why I brought that up though is because it gets broadened out to things beyond, I guess, alluding to the history of the country. So it's more of like the poor use of it encompassing really anything that they can find traces to in unequal outcome for all races, which ends up being everything. Because
no, actually, I'm sorry, just to interrupt. But what I mean is I'm not saying I'm not saying you look at slavery and only say that's systemic racism. I'm saying you can refer to systemic. I'm saying systemic racism as a term can be justified because the remnants, the after effects related to slavery and segregation are not fully gone. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, but that's not the argument that's ever made, though. The argument's made like Federal Reserve policy is part of systemic racism, because if the Federal Reserve cared about helping Black people lower their unemployment rates in equal ways white people, they would run with lower interest rates for longer, because it takes longer for Black unemployment to get lower as opposed to white unemployment, which typically recovers faster from recessions. So it's saying like, oh, look, the unemployment rates come back at a different rate. Fed policy relates to unemployment rates. That means Fed policy, unless it's done in a certain way that makes this outcome equal for the average aggregate Black data to equal the average aggregate white data, it's systematically racist unless we do it in a certain way. And it's like, well, you could argue the same thing about most policies. You can argue that all these policies around the minimum wage are systematically racist because they have unequal outcomes on different groups, and every policy has its trade-offs. So
I'm not convinced that's actually the major argument in favor of that term, but
no, I'm not saying that that's a major. Well, okay, well then I think. I mean,
I'm not trying to get bogged down in that conversation. Yeah. I'm giving my thoughts related.
I'm just going to say unequivocally, as a co-host on this podcast, that you're unequivocally wrong, because I consume more daily news than you. But I think the best arguments about using the term are the ones that you're saying. I think those are the best ones. I just don't think those are the main, or you can argue they're the main ones, but they're not the majority of them. But that's a different argument. Okay. You did bring up something interesting about Orwell talking about art and talking about propaganda and art. Although that's more on the propaganda line, and this episode's supposed to be about language, so maybe I shouldn't go on that rant. Is that a route we want to go down?
I mean, we can go down that route, I would say. I mean, I think it is relevant, because every statements every use of language does, to some degree or another, I guess, have certain assumptions or beliefs built into it. So, I mean, that's a fair conversation to have.
Well, I think I might. Okay, yeah, this is a good conversation to have because I think I might end up taking the negative on that. So one thing that I always joke about, and this is part of my point, is when I watch scary movies with friends, a lot of times I joke that scary movies are the most pro Second Amendment movies because it'll be like a home invasion scene, and the dad will grab a bat. And then you'll be like, why doesn't the dad have a gun? This is like the time you want a gun. I can't believe he doesn't have a gun. And then your takeaway like 5 minutes later is like, that something scary happened. It was supernatural. A gun wouldn't have stopped it, but I can't believe all he had was a bat. So we always joke like, wow, that's really pro Second Amendment scene right there. Now the issue is, one could watch the movie and make the argument I'm making, regardless of the director's intent. I would wager that most Hollywood directors that make horror movies aren't trying to make Second Amendment propaganda pieces, but that's the meaning I often will read into these scenes kind of as a running joke. So the one thing I want to get at is the role of intent when we're making when we're having this discussion about language, and I guess about taking away things from people's words. The other thing that's relevant is comedy. So if I called you a racist, imagine we didn't do 50 episodes of the show together, and I'd called you a racist on the street because I heard half a sentence of something you said out of context. I was like, dude, you're a racist, and then I like said a bunch of expletives at your direction. You would be offended because I would be like in good faith accusing you of being a person that you aren't. But you and I both know that if we throw on a Joe Rogan comedy special and he says a bunch of epithets, it's not meant to offend, and the intent is clearly matters. And that setting of the comedy show, his words are not supposed to be taken seriously in the same way that Jordan Peterson writing a book should be taken seriously, or somebody who isn't a pseudo intellectual person. But so I guess I wanted to delineate intent and context while thinking about things like comedy and thinking about artistic intent. How do you think that plays into what we're talking about with Orwell and being clear, I guess, and being precise, and then leading to the proper takeaways?
I mean, of course, I don't think if I watch a Joe Rogan comedy special, I'm not analyzing his use of language as much as I am if I'm watching a Ben Shapiro lecture, because Joe Rogan's trying to entertain, and Ben Shapiro is advocating for certain political views or certain policies. So yeah, I mean, I would agree with you on that. I mean, I think Orwell's point really is just that every piece of art or every movie, every poem, every novel, every short story, every song has a point of view, and you can't necessarily take the point of view out of the cultural and political context that it was created in. So actually, maybe Orwell really wasn't the best person to bring up in terms of this whole conversation itself. But in terms of like intention versus how like someone else perceives what you're saying, I think it's a tightrope walk that we're all kind of trying to walk down at all times, and it's not. I don't think there are clear-cut, easy solutions. No one likes to hear someone say that because they think that's a weak argument. But I mean, I can't say that my words don't matter. But I also can't always be worrying about everyone's every possible misinterpretation of every word I say, because then I just couldn't say anything. So I think it goes back to the individual. First you try to communicate as clearly as possible. in whichever context. You try to make your point. You try to minimize confusion when you're making an argument, especially in a public setting. Or if you're really just, if you're even talking to a friend and you're actually just trying to get an idea across, you want to try to minimize confusion. Some confusion is inevitable, because everyone kind of lives in their own little world. And so I think it's both. I think you have to think about both when you're, especially when you're communicating big ideas. And so if I'm critical about people like David Horowitz or David Horowitz or Dave Rubin, or any number of public intellectuals or journalists or whatever, it's because I don't think they're thinking about both of these things. I think they often solely think about their intention and don't think at all about, whether someone could misinterpret what they say. So yeah.
I think that's a fair way of talking about it. I think I agree with what you said there. I do think that fine line is the crux of the conversation about language, because I think there are people who happily engage in the world where they say lots of things publicly, and they aren't particularly cared about being misinterpreted. So like, for example, we do this show, and you and I kind of make it clear. We often do this 3-minute, intro to the show where we say things like, yeah, we're talking about this thing, but we're not experts, because we're not. We're people who have thoughts on the issues, and we think we have something to say, and we kind of want to feel it out. But we're not people who have written, a 400-page book on the effects of language and using certain phrases in politics. So that's never the intent. And for that reason, like, I kind of like having the public record of what I say, because I can always listen back to it, and sometimes I can better refine it. But there is like an exploration phase where using vague language isn't that bad. And there's also a lot of the context of content on the internet it's in the context of a dialogue. So like, if we're talking about interviews, if there's a certain tone and tenor to it where precise language doesn't always fit the interview. So like, this is kind of why I went on that systematic racism rant. It wasn't just because, or systemic racism. It's not just because I hate that term, but it's also because the people who I thought were using that term in a very imprecise and misleading way was people who were at these big neoliberal think tanks. And I would think that in that setting, you have the space to lay out points with a lot of data and evidence, and you don't need to use certain types of rhetoric. That's why when I listen to the Cato Institute do events where they have a guy who just wrote, a 350-page book about why immigration is always a net plus to the economy, I expect him to bring the data, right? But if he has a 35-minute spot on the Rubin report, I don't expect him to bring the data in the same way that he would to a Cato Institute lecture. So I know I'm wrapping around to the kind of the start of the conversation, but I will say the context does affect, I guess, people's ability to be, and this is something we talk about a lot, intellectual. So if somebody like does things in the medium that is most intellectual, like writing a book, and they are truly somebody who you're supposed to take seriously, then I agree with everything you're saying, right? It's very important that if a scholar writes a book on an issue, it should be clear. And that's why I will never recommend Dave Rubin's book. I've listened to it. It's fine if it just, in the same way that listening to Dave Rubin be a pundit for 6 hours is fine, in the sense that it's a generic right-wing pundit. But it's not going to be the same takeaways as you get from a scholarly book, because it is not clear and it is not precise, and you don't have to infer intent like you do with Dave Rubin, which isn't something you want your reader to have to do if you're actually trying to be convincing, or like an intellectual that's having a good faith conversation about issues. But I do think it's an element. I could be overstating how much of an element that is, but I think people are pretty sympathetic to their settings, and it could be because of my personal experience. You know very well that the second we debrief after this call, I have a tonal shift, because I'm way more happy to be saying nonsense if it's in a setting where it doesn't matter, it's not recorded, it's not going on the internet. And I'm way more likely to say things that are offensive, and I'm way more likely to make jokes. But in the context of I want to reckon with ideas, and I don't like that phrase, reckoning with ideas is pretty overused. That's something that Orwell would criticize in what I'm saying right now. But when I am here to reckon with ideas with you, I take a different approach, and I say things in a different way. And when I'm with my friends drinking, I'm not too worried about saying Obama's a communist to tie it all up. So I don't know. I think that's the way I've synthesized a lot of my thoughts. But I do think it is like worth calling out. So if somebody tells you that Dave Rubin's one of their favorite commentators, and you're like, dude, he opens his book with this lazy thing, this lazy stereotypical argument that is potentially dishonest. At best, it's not helpful. At its best, it's still a caricature if you're giving it the most good faith interpretation. So it's like, this isn't good, and you shouldn't be a huge fan of it. Here are other people that reckon with ideas in a way that will make you smarter. I think that's fair. And I'm with you full on board there, and I'm happy to call out kind of lazy thinkers for being lazy. So I think that's me. I think that's my olive branch.
I guess what I want to make clear is it's not as if like I can wake up tomorrow and never use imprecise language again just because I'm a god and I can just will myself to be, as great as George Orwell. Although if we were if we were alive when Orwell was alive and we were just having a normal conversation with him, obviously he might not speak as beautifully as he writes. So it's always a struggle. It's always something you have to try to reckon with in the moment and refine your skills over time. So I often make points like this, but I'll make it again. Just because someone uses a bad piece of language in one context or another doesn't mean I'm going to dismiss everything they say. Doesn't mean they have nothing of value to add to the conversation. Doesn't mean they're stupid. What it does mean is in that moment they could have been, or I think they should have been more precise, especially again in public context when we're talking about important issues. On the other hand, if I'm say a little self-critical, or if I'm giving myself a little constructive criticism, I think people like myself who are more, if it's more on the intellectual end, or who kind of think more about things, I can have a tendency to make another mistake that Orwell talks about, and like using academic jargon or using philosophical jargon that if I'm talking to an average person, they're going to be like, what? And I have to, then I have to unpack it. So I think I could use, when I think about Orwell's essay in particular, I think I could do better in saying what I have to say in more plain language, which would help when I'm trying to communicate my ideas. So you can be too academic in your use of language, or you can just be too colloquial in your use of language. Again, there's a happy medium somewhere. But I think it's important for each individual to kind of think about, well, how do I use language? What are, the strengths of the way I use, like, what are the good aspects of how I use language? What are the aspects that probably I should work on? So, yeah.
I agree with that. It is an aspirational thing, because like I know that I'm not a person who I do not say things in the most clear way, and I'm very aware of that. But one other thing that Orwell really raises in his piece that is something to be cognizant of is it's very easy to use jargon and to use flowery language in a way that is almost, it's not directly dishonest, but I think it's a way that Jordan Peterson, I think in like his books would argue is lying or not telling the truth. So since we didn't talk, we didn't necessarily cite a lot from the piece, but I would implore people to check it out, because there is a section where he talks about how one of the reasons why politicians use such flowery language is they're often defending the worst things possible. And I think this is something that kind of everybody does, is like if somebody asks you to justify something bad you did, and I don't mean that in like you killed somebody and you're lying about it. I more mean like, you know how like if you're slacking off at work and you don't think it matters, and then suddenly you realize you forgot you had a project due the next day, and if somebody's like, "What were you doing?" Like it is easy to use language to try to dress up whatever you're doing in a way that is very generous to yourself. And another example of this would be like you and I both know a lot about random issues. So if we're in a context where we're talking to somebody who doesn't know anything about economics, it can be a temptation to use jargon words just to sound more convincing. Because if you know the jargon and they don't, then you are now an expert, and now you are they will now defer to you because you are an expert. And people should be very conscious of when they are being misleading to make themselves not have to think. The other thing this goes to is how it takes energy to use your brain, right? Our inherent state is laziness. So if you realize you are in a position of expertise compared to another person, you can just kind of fool yourself into not having to contend with their ideas, because it's like, well, you don't know what GDP stands for. You don't know the relationship between GDP, GNP, and then trades, imports and exports. Like, why am I even talking about economics? I'm going to use a bunch of jargon and you're going to feel stupid. And it's like, no, that there's nothing to be gained by doing that. So there are a lot of things worthy of self-reflection. If you read through this Orwell piece, and so I'd recommend it to people, because it's a lot more than just how to be a good writer, but it's also how to be a good thinker, because that's what writing is. It's the exercise of thinking, putting your thoughts on paper.
Just, I guess I have two more quick points I want to make, and then we can wrap up the show. One, I think so. So when I think about like flowery language, I wouldn't completely dismiss flowery language as long as the person goes, backtracks and like, say I'm making giving a speech or giving a lecture, about some book I wrote. And then it's like, I want to it's like a controversial argument I'm making in the book. And so like I begin to talk and I make some outlandish statement, right? It's like, okay, so I think there is a place in like getting your audience's attention, or like trying to, kind of talking in such a way which is engaging. So again, it's like rhetoric is not totally, you shouldn't totally dismiss rhetoric as completely useless and evil. But you want to go back and say, okay, that's an outrageous statement. I know that's an outrageous statement. What do I mean by that? Okay, well, actually, what I mean is da 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 da. And then you can actually give the actual take you're saying, which was probably more nuanced than whatever statement you made. So there's that. And then the other thing that came to my mind as you were talking, as anyone who listens to this podcast knows, you're the biggest Bernie Sanders supporter in American history. That's a bad use of language right there.
Mm-hmm.
I think the reason Bernie Sanders was so popular, hate him or love him, is because he doesn't use flowery. He doesn't use academic jargon. He's not really an intellectual. He's not really a philosopher or a scholar. He's someone who you could almost say just kind of looks at the issues and kind of almost has a sense of what he thinks is right or wrong, and then he just goes and defends on that basis. He's not defending it on the basis of I guess what I'm trying to say is he's not like, he hasn't read a bunch of like philosophy books, and he's not putting it in like these abstract terms. He's not putting his policy positions in these abstract terms that you might find in a political science department. He is just using plain language to get his point across, and I think people like that. People really respond well to that, especially in terms of, in the case of Sanders, of course, it was very many young people who responded to that. Because Obama can use like the language of a technocrat, and as his I mean, he might have been a good speaker, but his speeches weren't terribly engaging. Most politicians' speeches aren't terribly engaging because they use a lot of jargon. I don't think Bernie Sanders does. Although I will add, I think I think another example of use of bad language in this podcast was when I called myself an intellectual earlier. So forgive me, internet, for bestowing such a high title on myself that I need to earn and not claim.
I I I think I understand the distinction making between Obama and Sanders, because I think Obama ends up doing the he does the same thing that a lot of the neoliberal side of the news that I listen to. So like a lot of finance and business news does, where they use certain terms that are overly technical to make things to give himself an expert status. I think that's something he did more than Sanders, but I think Sanders did a different way of obscuring real commentary. So I think we almost did it. We almost talked about a debate that involved Jordan Peterson. It was about free speech, maybe. It was an intelligence squared debate. And the person on the opposing side in this 2-versus-2 debate, I don't remember. It was Stephen Fry, Jordan Peterson, and it was against Michael Eric Dyson and somebody else. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Eric Dyson, but I don't really think Michael Eric Dyson has anything of value to say. He just really knows how to make words sound really beautiful. So he knows how to dance with language in a way that I will never understand. He will say these like triple alliterations out of nowhere that sound really good, and everything he says is prose. So even though prose can be good, prose is bad if you can't communicate the meaning of your prose, of the words or the ideas behind the prose. So I would say that Obama did that through jargon, and I would say Michael Eric Dyson does that through beautiful language that doesn't actually have any ideas supporting it. Or and if so, it's like he doesn't defend those ideas. The whole beast there is the prose. And I would say, in his own way, Bernie Sanders didn't really contend with ideas. It was really the aura, but I wouldn't say his aura was his prose or his jargon. So I think it escapes Orwell's overt criticisms, but I think it used a different type of jargon, which wasn't a very intellectual jargon. It was just I think his stump speeches were very buzzword dependent. It just wasn't high intellectual jargon. It was jargon more of the people. So I think it was just different brand of rhetoric. I'd critique all those in a little different ways, though. But I think we'll agree to disagree on Bernie Sanders' communications skills. I mean, he was an effective communicator. I'll give him that, because he did get a lot of young people support back in, I guess, 2016 and 2020. Okay. On that note, though, I'll let you get final word in, and I'll wrap it up and send us home, because I think that's happily all my thoughts on the topic.
Well, I guess I guess what I would say in conclusion is what I prefer, like what I think is the most beautiful use of language is when writers or speech writers or orators or whatever, their message is clear, but they're still they're still constructing sentences in a way which flows, which sounds nice to the ear, and it flows together properly. The sentences don't sound clunky. The sentences don't sound like there are like words in them that should have been taken out and rewriting and whatnot. It can be easy to, if you're a good writer, it can be easy to obscure your what you're trying to say in good writing. So again, it's a matter of combining your someone's ability to create beautiful prose with a clarity which gets the ideas across, in a way which isn't too bombastic or too obscure. This is why so on YouTube, I spend way too much time watching YouTube because I'm a Gen Zer, at least technically. And you always come across these like motivational speeches, from various figures. I'm always suspicious if I've seen probably quite a few of these videos actually. And I'm always suspicious of their use of language, because it's like, well, yeah, I mean, they're putting language in such, they're making me feel something with their language. But I distrust what they're actually getting at, or I distrust that they actually have any wisdom, um, or actually are actually going to really change my life if I listen to this talk, because again, they're speaking purely at the level of rhetoric. So I was defending rhetoric earlier, but again, if you know just if you talk purely at the form of rhetoric, well, then you are destroying Western civilization because you are not you don't actually have any content. So it's like the great Roman statesman Cicero, was a brilliant orator, but I think most historians agree that he was just one of those people who could give a speech in defense of practically anything, and it would just woo the audience over because he had such a great way of speaking. Not to diminish his oratorical skills, but he didn't always use them for morally upright purposes. So yeah, just don't be a motivational speaker is what I'm trying to say.
And then my whole final thoughts is that Obama is a communist. Okay, so with all that said, all that discussion on language and precision, I hope you all enjoyed that. We have 50 plus episodes in our backlog where we've talked about all other sorts of topics and ideas and conversations that popped out to us. We've talked about all sorts of stuff, and you can find that on Beyond Talking Points on YouTube, or you can find that in podcast feeds on all podcatchers. I do a solo show called the Obey Podcast where I talk about all sorts of stuff in the news. I had some tech difficulties, but I do want to cover an episode on the global corporate tax rate. I had some notes even written down, which is far more preparation than usual. I was all ready to talk about that, and then my computer totally had some issues yesterday. But hopefully that episode will be getting up in the next couple of days. You can find Matt's other content by looking up the Anti-Philosopher on YouTube, where he does vlogs and he talks about other things that come across his radar that we don't cover on the show. And and you can also you can check out the backlog, do all sorts of things. We've done all sorts of random content, and we're going to keep delivering more stuff that jumps out to us that we can argue about for an hour, because there's way too much out there that we tend to disagree on. And we've managed to keep that ethos of trying to disagree in a substantive way, which is what this episode in the end was really about, is how to have a conversation about things in a way that tries to convey substance. So that is something we will continue to attempt. But for now, we're going to leave it at that. So signing off, it's Matt. Thank you.